Welcome, everyone. In this segment, we're going to be speaking about the common good, what it is, and what its role is in Catholic social teaching. Catechism in the Catholic Church gives us a very good definition of the common good. So let's take a minute just to read that. Please note the second paragraph, which talks about the common good concerns the life of all. That's why, in fact, it's called the common good, because it's for everyone. As you can see, the common good has three elements: respect for persons, social well-being and development, and peace and security. And as we go along in this slideshow, we're going to discuss each one of them individually. As you can see, respect for persons puts an onus on the government to respect the rights of the human person et al. Now, one of the things we have to remember and highlight is that the government does not bestow rights. Rights are bestowed by God, and they're natural to the human person. And so the government, to be true servants of the people, must respect the rights given by God. And also vocations are given by God too. And when I say vocation, I'm not talking just about priestly vocation or to the religious life in some sort. A vocation is really our call by God to be either a member of the clergy or married persons, families, or a vocation to the single life. And it's the person's responsibility to seek God, to discern what their vocation is. But once they've discerned it, they have a right to fulfill it, and government cannot stand in its way or in the way of the person to be able to fulfill their vocation. Likely, too, is to act according to conscience and religious freedom. You know, we are bound to follow our conscience, just as we spoke of early on in this course, and the government can't take that away. So how could that possibly be? How do you see, or how do I see the threats that we have to conscience rights? Well, they're all over the place, and we could see just recently with the COVID vaccine. Is there a right or a role for government to say everyone must be vaccinated against this disease? Well, everybody ought to be vaccinated if their conscience permits it. So it is not the government's role to say you must do this or else, because that's clearly a violation of the common good element of respect for persons. Here we can see that the government has or should arbitrate between the various interest groups. So what does this mean in practicality? Well, in our judicial system, we see that the government has the duty to arbitrate between conflicting interests that I have or someone else has against me. So if I have a claim to X and someone else has a claim to the same X, well, it's up to the judicial system to mediate that and make sure that the proper person gets that particular claim, or that there is just compensation of some sort. So there is a role for the government, especially in the judiciary, to arbitrate the various conflicting claims. Now, the second bullet point talks about accessibility to these items, and I highlighted accessible deliberately because accessibility is different than government provision of these things. The church and the common good is not calling for socialized medicine or socialism of any sort. However, in justice and for the common good, the government ought to be able to provide subsidies for those who can't afford, say, health care. They should be able to provide subsidies in terms of food stamps, WIC, or what have you, for those who cannot eat. They should be able to provide subsidies for education, and the rest of these items that are listed here. But government provision does not come without strings, and we have to realize that. So What they can do to help matters when people need to flourish or families need to flourish. They ought to be doing so, but not at the expense of human freedom. And we're going to talk more about this subsequently. But it's important to know, as Kenny Rogers would say, when to hold them and when to fold them. And we need to be able to make a distinction between being made accessible for the things of human flourishing as opposed to being imposed upon us, or government providing all these things. It's very, very key and critical and important. Finally, we come to peace and security, the third element of the common good. There are many ways that this manifests, and we could get into them in subsequent conversations, but I want to highlight right now the right to legitimate personal and national defense. So how do we do this, and what does this right mean? Well, we'll talk about that as we move forward. But the one thing I want to mention here is that we all have this right to protect ourselves from an unjust aggressor. Somebody comes into our house causing us, or that we perceive to be bodily harm. We don't have to permit that to happen. So how do we protect ourselves? Well, one way that we have to consider is that legitimate defense does not mean that I have the freedom to put a bullet into his head and kill him. No, that's not what I mean, and that's not what the church means. What the church means is that we need to use said bullet in a way that's going to immobilize this person, or whatever it is that we have in our house, to immobilize this person until the proper authority comes and arrests him. So we have to balance between killing and defending. And we'll talk about that later. It's the same principle with national defense. Nation states have a right to protect ourselves from an invading aggressor. So how does that happen? Well, there's a whole process that has been developed over the years to give us an understanding of what a just war actually is. And again, we'll talk about that. But we have to come to terms with this idea that, nations need to take arms if it's necessary, and if there's no other way to protect ourselves from these forces that come to invade us, or whatever. And another very, very important discussion we're having now is the death penalty. Is it permissible to put a person to death? Is it not permissible to put a person to death when it comes to crimes that they're convicted of? And, as we'll see when we start discussing this a little further, the Catholic Church has said, no, there is never a reason to do this. Now, Pope John Paul II, before Pope Francis, said that left the door open just a crack. But through the decades, these last couple centuries, we've seen a chipping away and a chipping away and a chipping away as to when is this permissible and when it is not. And so we'll talk about justifications, as I said, later, but I think it's important to bring this to the attention that whatever we say about the death penalty, whatever we say about war, whatever we say about legitimate personal defense, is bound up tightly with the common goods element of peace and security.